I'm delighted to hand you over to Karim Taga. He is managing partner and global practice lead at Telecoms, IT, Media and Electronics at Arthur D. Little, and he will introduce our panelists. Welcome everyone and thank you.
Thank you. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, depending where you are. I hope you can hear me well. Let me get the yes to continue.
Yep.
Yes,
Hi there.
super. I'm very excited to have these panelists. I think they don't need a big introduction. They've been in the industry for 20, 30 years, I would say, right? Dean and Paul haven't seen it all. This is what the fifth standard probably that we experience with all the ups and downs we had. I'm very pleased also to see Dimitris. I hope I'm pronouncing the name properly. So as the title of the panel suggests, we talk about regions. If global standards like we had before, 3G, 4G, 5G, are actually regional. So there must be a reason why someone thought about this title that I'm happy to moderate. Obviously, the world is changing. We had just launched 5G, and this conference is about 5G. One of the messages that CEOs do not like to hear is that actually the message they're conveying to the industry about 5G is what was promised with 4G already. So unfortunately, the perception of many consumers is this way. Probably some industries and verticals sees it differently. And now we're already talking about 6G. I'm very keen to get your perspective today in terms of answering first the question around the regionality, but also about the standard. What are the expectations? And for sure, what kind of feature we can think of. I think Paul had some ideas. I'm sure that he will reflect back based on his experience. So let me start with the more provocative question. This question will go to Dean first. I think you know his kind of disruptive thinking. We always talk about harmonization and standards and, you know, the 3GPP standards taking over the IEEE and so forth. So let me start with the political angle first. Are we that aligned globally before talking about technology about the expectation and who is driving what? So what's your view on that?
I see that we're essentially going to have a bit, what looks a bit like a Coca-Cola bottle of, yeah, it was fairly diverse in the days of 3G when you had the CDMA world, the GSM world, and the TDS CDMA world in China, and the
nice platform. Remember Flareon we had?
Oh yeah, and
wireless.
PHS in Japan,
Exactly,
and slightly different versions of WCDMA in Japan as well. So it's sort of, and we've sort of gone through the 4G and 5G neck, and I think we're going to start to broaden out again for 6G, partly because of geopolitics, and you know, clearly there's some differences in views between China and the West, but even then there's actually some also sort of regional differences. If you look at what India is doing on 5G, it's a little bit different, or there's a version of 5G which is a bit different. We'll see how that goes in 6G. In fact, there's a non-3GPP 5G standard which is evolved from DECT for IoT. So there's actually, you know, two 5G standards today, even though the 3GPP community might like to try to own it. And so I think that in future, there's some of those frictions. And I also think to some extent, it actually doesn't matter as much as we think it does. I've got a view that harmonization is advantageous for things like scale economies, but on the other hand, it also represents, if you like, the equivalent of monoculture in agriculture. It's sort of, there's a strong argument for sort of biodiversity in one form or another, for resilience, for innovation, and so you can sort of do a read across from environmental issues to technology as well. And I think that the geopolitics, clearly, without going into all the details, there's increasing government focus on standardization. So you've got various countries which are very heavily looking at Open RAN. Other parts of the world which are looking at whether they can exert the sort of centralized 5G, 3GPP view of the world onto fiber. So there's, you know, which has some interesting implications for the open internet. So I think that those tensions are going to continue over the next few years. And the other side to it is, I was going to say that as everything gets softwareized, virtualized, obviously the radio can't be beyond a certain point, but there's a lot more software. It becomes ever easier to glue things together and create hybrids and gateways and dual mode this and hybrid the other. And from an engineering point of view, that's deeply inelegant. But from a pragmatism point of view, it might be easier and faster. And so we could end up with two systems and you've just got a dual mode phone. Yeah, is probably the answer which we're going to end up with.
Before asking Paul to give a perspective on that, whether he believes on the harmonization and if the industry can afford multiple standards and to think of the interoperability, asking a CTO for one of the major global operator recently, what is a future operator and what are the key capabilities you should have? I was surprised to hear, and this is probably an answer that was not there a couple of years ago, that in the first line, he sees himself as system integrator. That is, buying different pieces of module from different vendors globally, software-based, and putting the things together so that you can manage and operate, first of all, design and operate a network that has the huge complexity, carrying data left and right, up and down. And this was in the past within the responsibility of the vendors. Now they're taking over with Open RAN and many other initiatives, as you mentioned, Dean, that the key capability of the operator is actually to operate a network, meaning that you need to put the things together and make them work like an operating system, I would say. So I don't know if many would subscribe to this, but is that really the future role of telco? Following your scenario, basically, right?
Yeah, I mean, I think the issue is that there's going to be lots of different types of operators. Today, there's roughly speaking, certainly in mobile, 3 or 4 semi-similar operators in each country. They're national, they look roughly the same, they use the same vendors, and 5G from one is pretty much similar to 5G from the other, depending on spectrum allocations. But everyone talks about 5G being transformative, but I think the first industry that's being transformed is the telecoms industry itself. And I think that we already have more private networks than public networks, or smaller. And by the time we get to 2030 and 6G, there will probably be 100 times as many private networks as public networks, between 10 and 100 times. Some say 1,000 times more, but I think that's probably overdoing it. And so I think that the nature of who is or what is an operator, looking through the lens of today, is not the lens we can use for the 6G era.
Paul, being one of the biggest operator in Europe, how does this sound to you? Let's talk about the role of an operator in the second stage, but first in terms of new standards coming in, the fragmentation and so forth. You're mute.
I'm sorry about the mute. I might have to do that a bit later. The office I'm in is actually quite noisy. There's a railway line just next door, yeah. For a start, so in 6G, my personal view is we're way too early to be talking about 6G. We haven't finished the rollout of 5G by a long way. The major disruptive features that are going to be in 5G are still in the next 2 releases. So. And 5G will be with us for 20 years, and so it's very early to be talking about another generation. And also my view is the last thing we actually need is another generational change, and what we should be focusing on is an evolution. So yes, we need the research and development associated with the future telecoms, future wireless infrastructure. But I think it would be a real mistake if we followed the same implementation route that we have from 3G, 4G to 5G. Okay, so that's background. From a standards point of view, the success of telecoms, all telecoms, is standards, open standards, international standards. That has enabled, if you take mobile, devices to roam, to interconnect and interwork, and rationalizing those standards to a global set, in my view, has been very successful in both 4G and becoming the basis for 5G as well. And the reason for that is, Dean mentioned, is economies of scale. It allows network equipment vendors, it means device vendors to build equipment and have a global market. Useful analogy, I think, is Wi-Fi. Would we suggest that we shouldn't have a global Wi-Fi standard? Very cheap chipsets have been able to develop, very cheap system solutions. Your Wi-Fi on any of your devices works anywhere in the world. So that's what we should be aiming for. The way we've chosen to do that to date is via harmonized global standards. But that's not the panacea. I do see that the way we go about it is maybe not as efficient as it could. Maybe the telecoms industry ought to be adopting more of the approach that's coming out of the IETF or the software world. Particularly the software world, where to an extent, if you look at the open source community, the software is the standard. And as telecoms, as Dean was saying, has become more and more softwareized, maybe that is an approach that we should be adopting. I also do think that maybe.
But one question, I think you said, yes, we made a major progress with regards to the harmonization, and you don't want to see this kind of implementation again. One of the reasons is this harmonization comes with a higher price, which is the alignment of so many stakeholders to come up with a list of feature called release 16, 15 or whatever. And if you look at the software industry you just mentioned, the algorithm there is a bit different, right? So the question is, will our development continue the path, getting it better because we will learn eventually, or eventually will be disrupted, which is what what Dean mentioned. What's your view?
So the super tanker is heading in one direction. Okay, so to change the direction of that super tanker is going to require some effort. One thing, and I think the main effort is probably around how we go about developing those standards. So we actually do make it much more agile, and does incorporate as big a bunch of stakeholders as we can. My view is we really do need to guard against regionalization, particularly regionalization on a geopolitical view in standards. I think that will be a complete disaster for the industry. It doesn't seem to me that it would be a sensible thing to let happen. Okay, what we should though is make sure that we've got the scope of what we needed for those global harmonized standards correct, and we don't standardize. We only standardize what's strictly necessary. We don't standardize what isn't necessary, and I think there is a danger of going across those lines. So if we focus on the scope of what needs to be standardized, we look at what the method of doing it. I think that's the big step forward in the agility and overcoming some of the issues that we see with global standards as it is.
I see that Dean wants to react.
I agree that having a de minimis baseline of standards is useful, but I think the 3GPP in the past has been guilty of trying to glue lots of layers and create interdependencies between them. So if you want to have 4G or 5G, then you also need to have an IMS for this and another component for the other. And actually, the interesting thing about, you mentioned Wi-Fi being a standard, and it is, or there's a set of certifications, but there's also customized versions of wireless LAN for certain industries. So for public safety and for industrial, you have companies that come up with sort of proprietary tweaks on the QoS mechanism or the control mechanism. So, Siemens will do one for factory automation, which isn't, they can't even call it Wi-Fi because it's not certified, but it's essentially the same 802.11 under the hood, but it's with this sort of additional layer that services a particular customer group and use case. And I think that as 5G and then 6G get adopted by companies that are, let's say, there's perhaps a little less precious about the sanctity of standards, I think you'll start to see these embellishments and variations. And so you get divergence along with convergence.
Yeah, you're potentially right. I think a symptom of that, I think, is too many use cases which aren't particularly relevant to a wide area cellular network. And so I've seen some presentations recently where use cases for 6G were being talked about, replacing the wiring loom in cars. Well, what's that got to do with a cellular network? And so you don't want your wide area mobile network to be burdened with the requirements for use cases which aren't really relevant. I mean, that doesn't seem like a sensible thing to do. However, you don't want to end up with at the other end of the scale. And I think IoT, wide area IoT is a really good example in that there are multiple different standards. There's the 3GPP approach, say narrowband OT. You've got Sigfox, LoRa, etc. And the problem you have with that is that if you're a white goods manufacturer or even a vehicle manufacturer, which standard do you adopt? You end up, and I think this is a big problem in the IoT world. There's a certain amount of paralysis because you're thinking the next best thing is just about to come along, and so divergence does have pros, but it also has cons, and I think that is a potential con for not having global standards.
Dimitris, if you want to give your perspective, and we'll come back to the role of the operator later and discuss other scenarios, but please, I think it's time that you give your perspective as well. No I'm sorry for that, doing bad job as a moderator.
No problem. Just to say a couple of things. First of all, what I wanted to introduce is a perspective of a company that is working with various operators across the world, especially in Asia or Africa. And to a large extent, I think we should not forget that the fact that the standardization enabled these networks to be deployed across the world, it is because it made it easy for operators that wanted to follow up, to take a technology and deploy it. And it also made it easy to find the skills, to find the tools, to find the capabilities that made it the technologies available. And I think I'm with Paul on that. To lose standardization would be a pity because it will make it that much more difficult to create these networks across the world. In fact, what I think will happen if you do lose standardization is basically, or you minimize standardization, it will inevitably result in the vendors having a lot more power in some of those communities by actually, if you want, deploying what they require. And I think that will be not the right direction. To me, 5G, as again Paul mentioned, is still to demonstrate the additional capabilities on top of the MBB. We are still looking for these new services that are going to be applicable to everyone else. And to a large extent, I feel that the discussion about 6G is a good one, but perhaps needs to be educated with how we see those services being adapted and accepted. We are talking about verticals left, right, and center, right? And we still don't know what the verticals are going to do and how they are going to adapt this technology, because we don't quite know what the equipment and the hardware and the technology is going to be in reality. And to me, at least, we need to answer that question first and say, okay, you know what, these are the things that I want to do with 5G, and it would be great to actually do it in an environment that's standardized and common across the world, because it does give a lot of efficiency and a lot of less complexity. As a provider of service across the world, it is much easier to go and deliver a similar service to deploy a network rather than say, okay, I have to deploy technology X or technology Y, and I have this complexity and that complexity. I think that will make the problem a lot more difficult to resolve all these issues and increase the adoption of this technology.
I think you're right, both of you, Paul and Dimitris, where I'd like to tend to be on the side of Dean, and I shouldn't be as a moderator, but as some expertise in industry. I believe this will continue to remain so if the agility and the speed gets better. Look at what's happening in other industries. Who would have thought that Tesla will become the most sold car in Europe? And look at what Elon Musk is coming. He's coming with a Pi. You may have seen the new concept device that is fully integrated with the car. You have SpaceX to it. You have many other components. And if works well together and harmonized, we may see the same disruption that we see with the iPhone, with a complete ecosystem integrated where you have only space for 2 or 3 players, and not few hundred trying to align on a standard that will be, slower than what is being disrupted by some third party. And look at what's happening in the car industry. It's very interesting what's coming up with the conversion aspect as well, solving problem of multiple industry at once by one company.
I agree, Karim, and also actually the interesting thing for me at the moment is it's the private networks in the car industry as well as other sectors that are first with use of 5G standalone. That's actually going in production in some small scale factories and so on. And there will probably be, almost certainly be first with release 16, 17, 18. So by the time we actually start getting around to making 6G and defining it, the companies who have experience running, if you like, phase 2 and phase 3 5G won't be the MNOs. Because there's probably a 2 to 4 year gap, I think, between industrial adoption of the latest versions and features of 5G and the public network deployment of the same. And I think that you have to think through the path dependency of what does that imply is the people with the most experience of 5G in its most sophisticated guises might not be who we think they are.
Future will tell, and this is why we're here to describe scenarios. Nobody knows the future. We're not looking in a crystal ball. Dimitris, please.
I think from my point of view, the question is not whether disruption is going to come to the market, because to me that is almost inevitable. The example that you gave of Elon Musk potentially might come quite fast. The point that I'm trying to make is even in that situation, it is better to have some kind of harmonization across standards rather than ending up in a situation in which basically we're finding the example that I'm going to give is smart homes, where everyone has their own ecosystem, and I'm finding it very difficult to find the right sensor because it might be compatible with what I have, and it might not be compatible with something else. And I get something at home, I put it to work, and I cannot make it work, and I end up struggling, and if you want, resenting the technology that was going to give me something because it doesn't quite work. What is great about the smartphone and the mobile networks is I get a mobile phone. If it doesn't work, I know who I'm going to complain. I know who I'm going to argue with, and they will sort it out because it's in their interest to sort it out. What we're talking about 5G and 6G beyond that is, I think, more of an ecosystem of devices that will need to work for me. And to my mind, there are two diverging kind of use cases. The first is the consumer, myself going to buy a device or several devices that work for me, my phone, my perhaps sensors that I will have on top of me. And the other would be the private networks that want to do something specific. Now, how exactly that's going to work out, I'm not 100% sure. I mean, if I was 100% sure, I would be doing something else. But what I'm trying to say is, I think this is going to be proven over the next 3 to 4 years when we start seeing how the next technology that's coming in out of 5G is going to be adapted.
Thank you. Let's give a credit to the one who is raising his hand formally using the platform tool. Paul, you raised your hand formally, please.
I did, yeah. I like Dean's point about private networks. I think what we shouldn't, and maybe that leads into the discussion around what's the role of an operator. I mean, if you look at a company like BT, we currently service over 50% of SMEs in the UK with both mobile and fixed services. We have a big global operation as well, serving multinationals as well. Again, networking for them. Private networks is in the fixed world is core to the business, and that's we're doing that on 5G networks as well. So I don't think it's an either or. Okay, it's these are a set of evolving services that others may do, and of course with the advent of shared spectrum in the US but also in the UK as well, then it does give others the opportunity to use cellular technology to provide private networks along with your fixed infrastructure or your Wi-Fi type services as well. So I think this is an evolving landscape from a service point of view for all operators, and I kind of resonate a bit with Dean's point on that.
You were cut. With regard to the system,
you were cut. With regard to the system.
Hello, is all fine?
Yeah.
Hello. There is an echo somewhere. I'm hearing myself.
There is an echo somewhere. I'm hearing myself.
Paul, probably with regards to the system integration role long term, what is your role, assuming that the scenario that Dean mentioned with software everywhere and you will be buying different components for network functionality function, is that the primary core business of telco in the future?
Core business of telco in the future?
So, I mean, it's differentiate between what we do our infrastructure and the services that will provide that infrastructure.
We cannot hear well, I guess. Dean, are you all hearing Dimitris?
I think Paul, if you've got a headset, that would help. I was getting a round trip echo on that.
Yes, well, why don't you continue then, Dean, and probably we can move to the next point as well, right? So feel free to talk eventually about what are the scenarios of 6G. Eventually, we're talking about the network of the networks. Can you give some perspective? So for people who are joining the call today, the panel, and never heard about 6G, so what could we expect in terms of scenario?
Well, I mean, at the moment, we're still at almost like defining the design goals for 6G. Yeah, and there's probably going to be some of that which goes through academic research and then gets fed back in over time. And I think that there's always the cellular community that there's the sort of Lord of the Rings approach of, we want to be the one control layer to rule them all. And sort of Wi-Fi can be part of 6G, and satellite can be part of 6G, and everything, and fiber can. And I don't think it's going to work like that. I think that there will be some intersection points, but they'll be loosely coupled, because whether it's an IEEE technology or whether it's LEO satellites, they've got their own direction, their own use cases, their own ecosystems, their own investment cycles. And they'll interoperate with 5G and 6G where it makes sense. But I don't think there's going to be this sort of one ring to rule them all, despite the wishes of the cellular community. I think one of the things that I'm quite keen to see, and I'm going to sort of throw a couple of curveballs in here, which people aren't talking about, which I think would be nice, was we know we've got all these microservices in the core network for the cloud native 5G. I'd quite like to see as someone try to start specifying rather than a QoS function or slice function, how about having a CO2 estimation function as a microservice in the network, so that for any given connectivity session or instance, there's some mechanism for trying to understand the energy cost associated with that. It's not going to be precise, certainly on the first time round, but given what's going on in Glasgow at the moment, if we could somehow bake into the architecture some, at least, rather than try to do lowest latency, highest bandwidth, how about lowest CO2, or at least have that as a variable that's baked into the system. And the other thing I'd like to see more of is more situational awareness, whether it's of the, say, at the cell site or perhaps more broadly. And this perhaps goes into some of the Open RAN side of things and the RIC applications, where you could actually have machine vision and a camera on the cell site that was aware that it's raining or snowing, that there's traffic with high-sided vehicles which affect radio propagation. All of that stuff could be embodied in real time. And I think that's an area of interest. And actually on that, I'll mention that Open RAN, of course, is an ORAN, particularly ORAN Alliance, that takes existing 3GPP standards and builds on it in much the same way I was talking about before. So that's almost an example of this sort of, having a baseline definition and then allowing other parties to go further on top of it. I'll shut up and hand back over to Dimitris and Paul.
Yes, please, Dimitris, if you continue. Paul, you can test your technical equipment in a minute.
It's just to say a couple of things, because in terms of where 6G I think will go. One of the things that is quite close to my heart is I'm a radio propagation engineer. I mean, sites and how sites propagate has been what I've been doing in the industry for many years. And one thing that seems to be to me that is coming with 5G advanced and 6G is almost a situation in which the network is becoming a lot more adaptive on the radio side as well. There's a huge number of technologies that are being discussed, from intelligent surfaces, higher frequencies, and so on. And to my mind, these are great technologies. But one thing that needs to be considered as well is how do we actually make the networks deployable faster? How do we make them more appropriate but less costly and perhaps more efficient, as Dean mentioned as well, because a large number of the power footprint of an operator is the power that basically goes into every single site. And there, I think that the one thing that I would like to see being developed more is the ability to choose what the network does based on what is around it in a much more intelligent way. And I think we're talking about AI and ML as part of the network, but I think we need to start talking more about AI and ML as part of the deployment of the network. How do we make sure that we make the right decisions there, so that basically we have something that's both cost efficient, but energy efficient, or potentially meeting all the other societal goals that are going to come. Yes, will come with it.
Thank you, Dimitris. Paul, back to the role of the telco, because you're the telco representative here. So what is it in the future? What do you need to, let's say, own as a core capabilities and skills? And then we can go to the spectrum idea as well. We talk about terahertz, we talk about other things that are coming. So what's your view there?
Okay, all right. So role of operator in terms of being an SI for the infrastructure. I think we'll end up with a situation where it'll be horses for courses. With virtualization and disaggregation of network equipment being the default way of building telecoms equipment, and then with the advent of open architectures on top of that, so Open RAN being the poster child of that movement, but it's happening everywhere in all the telecoms infrastructure. Then you do end up with this situation where you've got your traditional systems integrators, your major equipment vendors as they are at the moment, We've got some great challengers emerging who are using that technology for inroads into the market. But you've then got the view that, well, should operators actually do their own systems integration, choose their components and integrate themselves? And I think you'll see some of the global MNOs particularly going down that route. Those with the technology skills and experience and knowledge of being able to do it. You'll also, I see other systems integrators, non-traditional systems integrators pop up as well, to offer those solutions. So, if you like, not less technically capable operators can hand that responsibility, outsource that responsibility to them. So I think we'll see a mixed economy of those things emerging, and it's already starting to happen. You mentioned
before going to the spectrum, probably one point. I do not see personally that all the operator will be in a position like that to be able to build capabilities and play the system integrator. We know that it's a scale business, and why would a telecom operator be the best company to join if you're a software engineer? I would rather go to other company than a telco.
Yeah, and that's what you've hit there is the nub of the business case is when is it beneficial to do yourself, and a number of the factors around that are not technical. Okay, it's who do you lay the liability off for outages. Okay, too. Can you actually recruit the skills? And as we all know, there's massive skill shortage in the world at the moment. So there's many other factors apart from the desire and want to do it. But there are it is opening up opportunities. I expect it's going to accelerate accelerate innovation. Okay, accelerate agility. So I think it's early days yet, but I think it's. Quite frankly, I think this is the biggest change in the way that telecoms is built that I've seen in my time in industry. Okay, but there's still a long way to go. Okay.
And in my view, coming back to what Dean said before, I see a tiering approach. Probably the big players could afford few things, but will not be able to deploy 5G and 6G in the future, following the same logic as we had before, because you will have very small operator who are isolated in one country, will not have the skills to do so. So the business model will change, the liability will change, all what you said before. And the big boys, so to say, would play a different game there. Very interesting.
It might not actually be, I was going to say, it might not be size related. I mean, if you look at what Rakuten is doing, for example, the number of engineers per million subscribers or whatever is far lower. Now, Rakuten's interesting because Rakuten is a cloud company that's become a telco rather than the opposite direction. So Rakuten's historically been a sort of Japanese version of eBay, Amazon, or something like that. So they're coming from a different point of view. And I think that you'll see some companies that are like that, or Vodafone recently announced it was hiring lots of software people. You've got Dish, which is working hand in hand with Amazon and VMware and others in a sort of much closer collaboration. China Unicom has got cross shareholdings with Alibaba and Tencent, if I remember correctly. So you're going to see some of the operators become much more software oriented, and others will, in a way, they'll almost become MVNO plus, and be more around the branding and the packaging and certain aspects of the network as well. And I think that we'll see that it's partly stratification and then partly verticalization. And you add into the mix all the tower companies and neutral hosts and a bunch of others here as well.
Well, you can finish your thought, and then I'll give Dimitris the last word.
Okay, so I think that's that's very valid. I think one of the things we mustn't forget when we talk about the telcos becoming integrators as well is it's not just the network layer. You've got the operational support, the channel support, etc. And I think that's that area of digitization and agility to deliver services, and is probably, in my view, probably where we should be focusing now. Okay, and integration, doing our own integration in the network equipment, further down the line, I think.
Thank you. Dimitris, you have the pleasure to conclude.
I think the point I wanted to make, also, we should not forget the vendors in this equation. The vendors are building a lot of the networks in the world, and they are taking more and more control of what is happening in the network. They take responsibility for KPIs, they take responsibility for how the network behaves, and increasingly in some cases they even take responsibility for net presence score in some networks. And I think that it is them also that they have a role to play. Which is also why I was saying that it would be useful to try to ensure that you don't become completely separate ecosystems. In some countries, vendors will have sole control of what they deliver to operators.
Absolutely. It's a good finishing point, adding the picture of the vendor who have to reinvent themselves. Will they become software company only? Will they keep the mixed, not proprietary, but their software running on also third-party hardware? That is a very interesting thing. Why not on Amazon or AWS or other platforms? So it's a very, very interesting discussion we're having right now with the future role of each of the players coming into the market, the existing one, but also the new one coming in the market, like you said, Rakuten, coming from a different angle. So it's a nice environment to be. I know we went a bit off of the 6G discussions, but frankly speaking, there isn't much to say. You can all download the different 3 or 4 concepts you'll find on the internet on what 6G is about. I thought the discussion is much more fruitful to talk about the key issues we see in the industry and having the different perspectives of system integrator, thinkers, as well as operator. And I hope that the panel was relevant and interesting for you. Looking forward to continue the discussion. We're just at the beginning.